basically the world is trying to figure out whether it's Putin or Biden. In a sense, they're both crazy answers. Where does logic lead you here, James?
Well, it's a bit like the last 2 years. There is no logic. It's all inverted. I mean, the first casualty of conflict or war seems to be the truth. We're living in this world of the art of the bamboozle, whereby basically every side blames each other, but we don't really get to the truth. But all we can do is ask some questions. A point that you mentioned just before is about motives. What are the motives behind this? So, for instance, Putin, what are his motives for effectively, allegedly sabotaging his own asset? That asset that basically gives him a form of brinkmanship over this conflict. I'm no fan of Putin, but I do understand basically what are assets in terms of brinkmanship within a conflict. It makes no real sense for him to scupper his own pipeline for two reasons. Firstly, brinkmanship and turning the taps on and off. But secondly, from his own economic circumstances as well, because of the infrastructure costs. And then you've got the Americans. What are the interests for America here? Well, the interest for America is possibly a little bit more control of gas supply, diminishing the Russians' assets on this and their own negotiating position. And there's also a new pipeline that, funnily enough, as you mentioned earlier on, is opening up at the moment across the Baltics from Norway. So you put all these things together, plus all the environmental costs as well. You know, if you're talking about net zero and save the planet, this might present a little bit of a problem that needs to be discussed. But we're in a situation where everyone's just picking a side. And we've had this time and time again. We're getting rhetoric from both sides. It is up to us as individuals to pose questions. That doesn't mean that we are a Putin sympathizer, in the same way that questioning the restrictions on COVID don't mean that we're COVID deniers, in the same way that questioning aspects to the net zero policy, that doesn't mean that we're climate change deniers. What we want is a discussion and a debate on all these aspects in the round.
Well, let's just do that, and let's ask the question, because all the so-called moderate, normal people at the BBC and elsewhere seem anxious to push the idea that it's obviously Putin. If that were the case, isn't it extremely bad news for the world? Because it suggests that Putin, if he's blowing up his own pipeline and his own leverage over Europe, has in a sense decided he's got nothing to lose, and this would be the prelude to going nuclear or whatever comes next.
Well, there's an element of the sort of the concerns about escalation, and this certainly does escalate it. But then there's escalation in terms of who done it. But in terms of, you know, it's about what Putin's done in terms of his number one economic brinkmanship throughout this conflict has been that pipeline. Effectively, he's just removed that now. So that the question therefore has to be asked, what would be his motives for doing so? And also needs to be asked is, if you're looking at the other side, did they do it? You know, it's like a whodunit, the whole thing. But that's what happens in conflict and war. You end up having both sides that are trying to smear the other side, and somewhere in the middle, there lies the truth. There's three sides to every story in a conflict, one side, the other, and somewhere in the middle there is the truth.
Yeah, and we have these, it's like funhouse mirrors reflecting back on each other. Do you know, after Afghanistan, people say, oh, well, this couldn't be the Americans because Denmark and Germany are their NATO allies. Well, when they bugged out of Kabul, they didn't let the British or anybody else know that they were abandoning Bagram Air Base. Those guys just woke up in the morning and found that all the Yanks had left. So if they were doing something like this, it's entirely possible that they wouldn't let the Danes and the Germans in on it.
Yeah, exactly. They've got their own motives. I mean, this is the thing. It's about one of the key aspects of this entire conflict, which hasn't been raised too much for a while, is basically what are the assets within this? What are the connecting stories around Ukraine? One of them is obviously about gas supply and oil supply. So those are things that have to be discussed. In the same way, looking back at the Iraq conflict, where there's parallels with this as well. We were told to believe at the start of the Iraq conflict that this was basically against the axis of evil. Then obviously the debate changed for various reasons over the years, but fundamentally the heart of that particular conflict was obviously some of the natural resources that were going through that country in terms of and also the pipeline access. We've got the same issue here as well, whereby it's advantageous, obviously, for Russia to play sort of brinkmanship with these pipelines, but it's also advantageous for the US to get a certain amount of leverage and control in that area in terms of gas supply. It's been a recent deal, I think it was in June, between some transportation of gas between America and Germany. So there's so many different factors at play. So it does become a whodunit, but then what's happening is everyone's framing it according to their own natural bias. Instead of actually going, right, before I form an opinion on this, maybe I need to do a little bit of research and do a bit of digging about the issues around why something like this happened.